Do I think TRPC will still be useful in Next.13? Absolutely, I do. We're already working on some fun things with it. Yes, it will be very useful. It has its own batching stuff that is fantastic. It has a mutation layer. It has a better cache layer. It has a bunch of things that aren't even considerations of server components in Next.13. Actually, let's start with this. What I want to talk about for a bit here is app lifecycles, Next.13, and the relationship between all these things. So, Next.13 is a massive change. The ways in which we define the structures of our applications and render them on the server is fundamentally different. It is way easier to fill your application with data correctly, both data that the server generates as well as the data that the client generates. So if we have like one of my favorite lines where on one side we have the server and on the other side we have the user on the other side. What Next.js was doing was this area here, fill this in, next rendering content. So, I don't necessarily like that. So there's the server. We'll say that's on AWS or something like that. So here we'll have AWS. We have like Vercel as a layer in front. Then we have Next. Then we have React. Or we have the HTML that the user gets. Then we have React. AWS, Vercel, Next.js, React, HTML, DOM, user. So a user makes a request that goes to the Vercel system or servers that are really just AWS servers. They run code, which is your Next.js code, and then that has React within it that creates HTML and DOM entities. I'm liking this way of doing this less and less. I'm trying to rethink this one. This is a hard thing to communicate. We're going to do it through the history of a request. So we have a request that the server receives and it has to respond to. So for the server to respond to the request, it has to process it, which will just count as part of the request. It has to identify code to run for request. Then it runs that code and I'll just say run that code. Runs that code to generate response and then send response to user. Most of what we talked about at NextConf was very specifically this area here. So between once the request is processed and stuff is sent to the user, this area has been optimized a ton. It is way easier now to build pieces and it is way easier to componentize your routing, your data, and your components in a way where you have a much more logical structure for how the server generates the first set of data in the HTML for the user. But there's an important thing it doesn't do. And the reason I drew this diagram is that this line doesn't stop here. This keeps going. So we have the user, but what we have here is a long-lived session. And once this first request has gone through, so in the middle here, it's first paint. All of what we've talked about so far is first paint. How we get the initial data to the user. It's not how we update it. What happens when the data that we fetched is changed because a user makes a mutation locally? Let's say there's a form. So in this case, the user is updating their profile data with a form. So at this point, the user has content. At some point here, user inputs data into form. User submits form to server. Client updates with new data. So if I have a page, let's say, that has like my user info on something like Twitter, where it says my name, my username, my handle, my description or bio, whatever, and I hit edit and I change those things, what forces the components underneath to actually be different when I hit save? None of what Next talked about today does that. None of what Next.js talked about and the Vercel team talked about at NextConf addresses anything past this line. I think that's very important to understand when we talk about Next.13 and all of the cool things that are changing with it. They are much more app friendly now, but they are not more app friendly in the long-lived session sense. They are more app friendly in the architecture of an application up to this point sense. Something like Remix is much more cognizant of this side too, And they have a very prescriptive way of doing that I don't necessarily agree with. But Remix cares way more about this side. And we have not seen any of that here. That doesn't mean this is bad. It's actually really cool stuff. And I want to talk a lot about it. But I want to make sure we have a shared understanding before we go in of what Next does. Next.js does this, not this. Hopefully this makes things clear. And when I get asked, does this change T3 stack? No, because T3 stack is much less concerned about this side and way more concerned about this side. In fact, we actually, up until now, have kind of recommended ignoring this part as much as possible. Because what this part is get server-side props. And if we can, instead of using get server-side props to generate that first pass on the page, we can have static pages that have minimal data that is then requested, updated, and managed by the client as simply as possible through things like React Query, things like TRPC, things like good webhooks or WebSocket providers. That's what this side is. And we have kind of chosen to compromise this part in order to make this part as good as possible. That is the thing that is so exciting right now, is with the new primitives that Next.js is providing us with version 13, it makes way more sense for T3 stack to do stuff on this side. Finally. It's been hard to justify for a while, but now we can, and I am hyped.